The land stretched wide and merciless, a plain of dust and sagebrush rolling endlessly toward a horizon painted with smoke-colored clouds. Elias Boone rode slow, shoulders bent against the wind that clawed at his coat. His horse was as weary as he was, ribs showing beneath a dull hide, each step deliberate, cautious, as though the earth itself might swallow them if they hurried. Elias had been riding for days without the comfort of a voice, a fire, or the weight of something worth calling home. His only company was the whisper of leather straps and the groan of old saddlebags. Toward evening, the shape of a house rose from the land, lonely as a gravestone. Its boards were sun-bleached and warped, the roof patched with tin that glinted weakly in the fading light. A fence once meant for livestock leaned into the dirt, defeated. The smell of wood smoke drifted faint, telling him someone still fought to keep life within those tired walls. He reined in, staring long, as if asking whether he had the right to approach, whether the place would welcome or spit him back to the desert. On the porch stood a little girl, barefoot despite the bite of the air. She clutched a ragged doll by its faded dress, hair tangled like wild straw, eyes too wide and too knowing for her years. She didn't hide when she saw him. She didn't run, either. She just watched, a mixture of hunger and hope softening her small face. When his horse halted before the steps, she whispered as though the words were meant for the wind but carried straight to him. "My sister is perfect for you. Please protect us both." Elias blinked, as if struck by something heavier than any bullet. He opened his mouth but found no words. Before he could gather a response, the door behind her creaked. A woman stepped out, rifle leveled, eyes sharp beneath the shadow of her shawl. Her face was young still, but the lines around her mouth told of nights without sleep, winters without warmth, burdens that had aged her faster than the years should have. "Clara," she said, voice stern, clipped. "Get inside." The girl startled, pressing the doll close to her chest. She retreated toward the doorway, though her gaze clung to Elias, unwilling to let go of the strange rider she had summoned with her plea. The woman kept the rifle raised. Elias dismounted slow, hands open at his sides. He had seen suspicion before, seen it in towns that wanted no drifter's shadow, in faces that judged the scar carved across his shoulder, in eyes that feared a man who carried nothing but a stillbag and silence. But this woman's suspicion was different. It wasn't just mistrust. It was weariness, a soul stretched too thin, a heart sealed against disappointment. "I mean no harm," he said, voice hoarse from days of dust. "You're trespassing," she replied. Elias nodded, accepting the truth. "I'll move on. Just needed water for my horse, maybe a place to warm for the night. I'll pay in work if you've got need of it." She studied him long, the way a hawk studies a snake. Her grip on the rifle never loosened, though her eyes betrayed a flicker, not softness, not yet, but the recognition of something familiar, another soul marked by loss. Behind her, Clara's small face peeked out, lips pressed tight, as if holding back more words her sister would not allow. At length, the rifle lowered, not in trust but in resignation. "One night. No more." Elias dipped his head. He led his horse to the side of the porch, tying it near a post where the boards had begun to rot. Inside, the cabin was close and dim, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the bitterness of strong coffee. The hearth glowed faintly, throwing shadows across walls scarred by years of storms and solitude. The woman busied herself with the fire, refusing to meet his eyes. Her movements were practiced, efficient, stripped of any softness. The girl hovered nearby, doll swinging from her hand, gaze darting between her sister and the stranger now sitting stiff in a wooden chair. Elias sat silent, hat in his hands, feeling the weight of her words still hanging in the room. "My sister is perfect for you. Please protect us both." They rang not as a child's fancy but as a plea carved from desperation. He looked at Anika, though he did not yet know her name, and saw the shawl draped over her shoulders like armor, the way her lips pressed hard against the ache of loneliness, the way her eyes refused to rest too long on him. She was widowhood made flesh, survival wrapped in silence. Clara curled near the fire, doll pressed to her chest, lids heavy with sleep. When the flames popped, she startled, then reached for Elias as if he were already a guardian. Anika scolded her softly, voice roughened with fatigue, but Elias only lowered his eyes, as though accepting the unspoken charge. That night, he lay on a cot near the hearth, listening to the storm gather beyond the walls, the whistle of wind in the eaves, the creak of wood shifting under strain. In the shadows, he could see Anika sitting in her chair, rifle across her lap even as her head bowed with weariness. Clara stirred once, murmuring in her dreams, and Elias found himself whispering words he had not spoken in years. "You're safe." He wasn't sure if the girl heard, or if the widow noticed, but the promise bound him nonetheless. In that quiet, surrounded by dust and silence, Elias felt the first stirrings of something he had long thought buried, the faint, dangerous pull of belonging. Morning came pale and grey, the light of it seeping through thin curtains like a ghost reluctant to enter. Elias rose before the others, drawn by the habit of years when sleep was a fragile thing and the dawn always meant moving on. The cabin smelled of ashes cooling from the night fire, of damp wool drying near the hearth, of a home that had endured too much silence. He stepped softly, not wanting to wake them, but already he could feel the weight of what lingered in that room, remnants of lives no longer lived. By the door, tucked neatly to one side, stood a pair of worn boots. Too large for a woman, too heavy for a child. They were dusted but not used, as though waiting for feet that would never return. Elias's gaze lingered there longer than he meant, his chest tightening with a recognition that needed no words. Later, when Anika moved about the house, silent but efficient, he noticed more. A cedar chest, old and scarred, with its lid cracked just enough for a sliver of white fabric to peek through. He had seen such cloth before, lace yellowed by years, too fine for everyday wear. A wedding dress, folded away like a pressed flower, too delicate to throw out, too painful to look upon. On the mantel above the hearth sat a small locket, its clasp broken, its face cracked across the middle. He wondered if Anika still opened it when Clara was asleep, or if she could no longer bear to. She carried grief as if it were stitched into her shawl, worn close to the body, shielding and suffocating all at once. Elias had known women who wept loud, who cursed their loss, who turned grief into fire. Anika's was quieter. It hung about her like weather, constant, unyielding, shaping every motion she made. Elias, too, carried his own shadows. The scar across his shoulder, puckered and angry, reminded him with every shift of his arm of the battle that had taken brothers from him. The war had left him alive but estranged, cast adrift from the farm he once called home. His father had turned him out, weary of a son who came back with nothing but wounds and silence. Since then, the road had been his only kin, dust his only inheritance. Around the hearth, the silence pressed on him. Anika spoke little, only what needed saying. She set food on the table without ceremony, bread coarse with ground husk, coffee strong enough to sting the tongue. She ate without looking at him, though he saw the way her eyes, dark as the soil after rain, lingered when she thought he wasn't watching. It was Clara who broke the heaviness. She laughed in quick bursts, chasing the half-wild chickens outside, her feet leaving prints in the pale dust. She asked Elias endless questions, about his horse, about the scar she glimpsed through his shirt, about where he came from and whether the stars looked different there. She braided the manner of his tired horse with clumsy fingers, humming songs half-remembered from her mother, perhaps, or simply invented as she went. Elias found himself answering her more than he intended, his voice rusty but willing. He told her about rivers that froze in winter, about deer that moved like shadows through the trees, about the sound of cavalry horns echoing over hills. He left out the blood, the fire, the broken cries. Children didn't need those memories. He gave her only the gentler truths, and when she smiled at him, he felt something ease in his chest, as if the walls of his heart were being slowly pried apart. Anika remained distant, though she watched when she thought it safe. One afternoon, Elias found a broken chair near the door, its rung splintered. Without asking, he set to work, pulling a knife from his thul bag and shaving the edges, fitting them together again. The sound of his hands at labor filled the room, steady and calm. He sensed her eyes on him. When he glanced up, she turned away, pretending to busy herself with mending a shawl. But he had seen it, the brief softening, the way her lips nearly parted as if to speak. She noticed the steadiness in him, the way he worked without boasting, the patience in his hands. Perhaps it reminded her of what she had once known, of a husband who had stood in this cabin repairing, providing, promising. That night, as the fire settled low, Elias sat near the hearth, his gaze wandering to the locket on the mantel again. The cracked face of it seemed to watch him, to judge him, to remind him he was a stranger sitting in the shadow of another man's memory. He wondered how long a woman could live in such company, clinging to ghosts. He wondered if he himself was any different, clinging to scars, to a war long past. Clara fell asleep curled with her doll, breathing soft. Elias thought of the words she had whispered on the porch, "My sister is perfect for you, please protect us both." They echoed in him still, impossible to ignore. The child had spoken them with such certainty, as if she could see further into his heart than he could himself. He lay awake long into the night, listening to the slow creak of the rocking chair where Anika sat in silence. Neither spoke, but in that quiet, Elias felt the weight of something unspoken between them, not welcome, not yet, but recognition. A shared language of loss, a kinship forged in absence. The cabin was not just walls and wood. It was a shrine of memories, a place haunted by what had been stolen. And though Elias told himself he was only passing through, he could not shake the sense that fate had set him here, in this fragile shelter against the emptiness of the plains, to reckon with the ghosts that bound them both. The storm announced itself long before it arrived. A low moan rolled across the plains, carrying with it the scent of snow and the restless weight of something larger than the land could contain. Elias stood outside, tightening the rope on the lean-to where his horse huddled, when the first flakes began to fall, slow, heavy, as though each carried a burden of silence. By the time he shut the cabin door behind him, the wind had risen to a howl, clawing at the roof, rattling the shutters like angry fists. Inside, the firelight flickered across the room, throwing shadows against the rifles that hung above the hearth. The air grew colder despite the flames, and even Clara abandoned her games to curl close to her sister, wide-eyed as the walls creaked. Snow pressed against the windows in thick, gathering drifts. It was a night meant for staying still, for clinging to what warmth the cabin could offer. Then came the pounding at the door. Not a knock, not a measured sound, but a frantic weight thrown against the wood, rattling it on its hinges. Elias was on his feet before thought reached him, rifle in hand. Anika froze, her eyes flickering toward Clara, who clutched her doll so tightly it seemed the fabric might tear. The door shuddered again, and before Elias could bark a warning, it gave way to the storm. Snow swirled inside, carried on a wind sharp enough to cut. A figure collapsed across the threshold, half buried in white, skin blue with cold. He was young, no more than 20 perhaps, his black hair heavy with ice, his face marked with the paint and heritage of an Apache. Elias raised his rifle, heart pounding. Memory surged, flames on the horizon, war cries cutting through night, the scar seared into his shoulder by men painted like this one. His finger brushed the trigger. But Clara moved first. She darted past him, dragging a blanket from the cot, her small hands trembling as she tried to cover the fallen stranger. "He'll die," she cried, voice breaking through the storm's roar. "Don't let him die." "Clara!" Anika's voice was sharp, but she knelt by the stranger all the same, her hands quick, steady. She pressed her fingers against his throat, searching for life. A faint pulse answered her. "He's alive," she murmured, then looked up at Elias. "Help me." Elias did not move. His rifle remained trained, though the weight of it burned in his arms. "His Apache," he said flatly, as though that explained everything. Anika's gaze hardened. "He's a man dying in our doorway." Snow piled higher against the walls, wind shrieking through every crack. The storm made prisoners of them all, and Elias knew it. Still, his jaw clenched. He had buried too many men who never saw mercy from painted riders. Could he give what had never been given? Clara tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wet with pleading. "Please," she whispered. "He needs us." Elias lowered the rifle by inches, the fight within him louder than the storm outside. Finally, with a curse under his breath, he set it aside and knelt. Together they dragged the young man fully inside, closing the door against the blizzard. Snow melted into puddles on the floorboards. His skin was fever-hot beneath the ice, breath shallow, rattling. They stripped away his soaked hide coat, revealing a body thin from hunger, a gash along his side half frozen shut. Anika fetched hot water, cloth, whatever scraps of medicine she had hidden in jars. Elias sat stiffly at first, arms crossed, watching her tend the stranger as though she were tending a brother. But as the minutes passed, he found himself holding the man steady, pressing cloth against the wound, feeling the tremor of life refusing to let go. "His name," Anika said quietly, "will not change what he is. But I will not let him die in my house." Elias said nothing, though the words burrowed into him. He remembered too clearly the night her husband's death had been spoken of by neighbors, the story of painted riders who struck fast and cruel. But he also remembered whispers of outlaws who stole faces not their own, hiding behind tribes' names to mask their greed. The truth had never mattered to a man staring down a rifle barrel. Hours dragged, the storm unrelenting. The cabin walls groaned as though they might split. The fire burned low, shadows bending and swaying across the three of them huddled by the hearth. Clara had fallen asleep against Elias's arm, her blanket tangled around her small body. Across from him, Anika kept vigil over the wounded man, her expression unreadable, not trust, not forgiveness, but a stubborn refusal to surrender her humanity. Elias's eyes fell on the stranger's hand, calloused, scarred by work. Not so different from his own. He thought of the war, of how many men he had judged enemies simply for the ground they were born on. How many graves were filled with that mistake? When the storm reached its height, rattling the cabin as though to tear it apart, Elias leaned back, staring into the flames. Mercy sat uneasy in him, like a stone he could not swallow, yet he knew the choice had already been made. The stranger lived because of them. And perhaps, though he could not yet admit it, because of him too. The wind howled like something wounded outside, shaking the world. But within the cabin, 3 strangers, widow, drifter, and half-dead warrior, shared a fragile circle of firelight. Elias did not trust him, not yet. Perhaps he never would. But for the first time in years, he wondered if suspicion was not the same as survival. And in the crackling of the storm, he felt the old walls within himself tremble, as though some part of him might finally break open. The storm refused to pass. Day after day the wind battered the walls, snow piled high against the windows, and the 3 of them lived bound beneath the same roof, forced to share warmth that none of them had chosen. The fire became their anchor, its glow steady in the dimness, its crackle the only voice when silence grew unbearable. Koa, for that was the name the young man gave when at last he could speak without his lips trembling, grew stronger with each passing day. At first he lay still as a shadow, the fever burning through him. But as the days wore on, he rose to sit by the fire, to mend his torn shirt with the needle Anika gave him, to fetch wood in short, stumbling walks that lengthened with each attempt. His movements were deliberate, respectful, never presuming. He took only the space given, and when thanked, he bowed his head with quiet dignity. Elias watched him always, suspicion thick as smoke. He measured the strength in the young man's shoulders, the sharpness of his eyes, the grace with which he carried himself despite his wound. He knew warriors when he saw them. And yet, this one did not boast, did not take, he waited, listened, labored silently. It unnerved Elias more than defiance would have. Anika tended him without hesitation. She ground herbs into poultices, laid fresh bandages over his side, stirred broth for him in a tin cup. When she spoke to him, her voice lost its edge. Not soft, never that, but less guarded, as though she recognized something honest in him that did not need proving. Elias could not understand it. He told himself it was only compassion, the simple duty of a woman who could not watch another life slip away under her roof. But when he saw her eyes linger a heartbeat longer on Koa than on him, the truth stung deeper. The cabin became a place of silent battles. Stairs crossed between the 2 men like sparks over kindling. Clara seemed blind to it all. She braided strands of yarn into the horse's manner, asked Koa words from his language, and laughed when he spoke them, repeating the syllables clumsily until he smiled despite himself. With Elias she asked stories of far-off rivers and battles she could not imagine. To her, they were not rivals, not strangers, but pillars holding the same roof over her head. One night, when the storm clawed loud against the shutters and the firelight painted the room in amber and black, Koa spoke at length for the first time. His voice was low, carrying a cadence of sorrow. He told of a village scattered, of soldiers who came under the flag of truce and left behind ashes. He spoke of family lost to hunger, of wandering without anchor, of betrayal carved so deep it was no longer a wound but a scar that shaped him. Elias sat stiff, hands around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. He had heard tales like it before, dismissed them as lies or excuses. But here, staring at the young man's face lit by the fire, he felt something shift. The grief there was not performance. It was the same grief he had seen in mirrors, in Anika's guarded silence, in the weight he himself carried from battlefields that left him adrift. And yet unease gnawed at him. Not only because of who Koa was, but because Anika listened in a way she had never listened to him. Her eyes softened, her mouth curved in something close to sorrow, perhaps even kinship. It was not affection, not yet, but it was trust, and that pierced Elias more sharply than any rifle shot. When Koa finished, the room fell quiet but for the wind's howl. Elias stared into the fire, the heat prickling his scarred shoulder. In the reflection of flame on steel, he saw himself not as a protector, but as a man on the outside looking in, a wanderer watching others find belonging where he had none. Jealousy stirred in him, bitter and restless, though he could hardly name it. Later, when the cabin darkened into sleep, Elias lay awake on his cot, listening to the faint breaths of the others. Clara curled safe against her sister. Koa's breathing was slow, steady. Anika sat for a time in her chair, shawl wrapped tight, the firelight outlining her face in lines of weariness and resolve. For a moment Elias thought she glanced toward him, a flicker of acknowledgement, a recognition of his constant watch. And in that fleeting instant, the jealousy eased, replaced by something even more dangerous, the aching hope that he might matter to someone again. He turned onto his side, closing his eyes, but the truth followed him into dreams, that it was not hatred chaining him to suspicion, but longing. longing for a place at the fire, longing to be more than a shadow passing through. When at last the storm broke, the world was white and silent, a vast shroud of snow stretched across the plains. The cabin, half buried in drifts, stood like a ship marooned in a frozen sea. For a brief morning, there was peace. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Clara's laughter rang as she leapt into the snow, sinking waist-deep and shrieking with delight. Even Koa, pale but stronger now, managed a thin smile as he watched her tumble about. Anika's hands were busy with chores, yet for once her eyes did not seem so heavy. But peace on the frontier never lasted long. They rode in by noon, 6 of them, dark figures against the bright snow, their horses steaming from the cold. Elias saw them first from the window, the cut of their coats, the swagger in the saddle, the rifles slung careless and mean across their backs. His blood chilled before he even reached for the rifle by the door. He knew those faces, the same men who had painted themselves in stolen colors, raided like savages, and left widows behind while blaming tribes. They were carrion feeders, men without honor, and they had found their way back. The riders reined up before the cabin, laughing among themselves. One leaned forward, spitting into the snow. Another called out, his voice sharp and mocking. "Widow still breathing? Thought you'd have followed your man by now." Anika froze where she stood, the dish in her hand trembling before she set it down. Clara pressed close to her side, wide-eyed. Elias stepped into the doorway, rifle steady, boots planted in the threshold as if his body alone could bar the way. His scar burned beneath his coat. He had faced worse, but never with so much to lose standing behind him. Koa rose slowly from his chair, pressing a hand to his side where the wound still ached. His other hand found the hatchet leaning by the hearth. He walked to the doorway and stood beside Elias. Though still pale, his eyes held no fear. The outlaws laughed again. "Well, look here. The widow's found herself some company. A soldier and a savage. Makes sense, I suppose. Misfits keep to misfits." The words struck like stones, but Elias did not flinch. His voice was low, even. "You've had your say. Now ride on." They did not ride on. The leader dismounted, boots crunching in the snow, grin full of teeth. "Not before we take what's owed. That cabin, that land, even that widow, none of it was meant to outlast her man." The wind carried the smell of smoke and gun oil. Time slowed. Then came the crack of the first shot. Elias fired clean, dropping the man where he stood. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. Gunfire split the silence of the plains. Elias moved with grim precision, every pull of the trigger not for his own sake but for the life of the widow and child inside. His scarred shoulder screamed with pain, but he did not falter. Koa leapt from the doorway into the snow, dragging Clara behind a log pile as bullets snapped through the air. He shielded her with his body, returning fire with the hatchet thrown swift and true. It buried itself in a man's chest before he could aim. Blood splattered red against the snow, bright as a banner. Inside, Anika's hands shook as she reached up to the mantel. There lay her husband's rifle, untouched since the day he fell. She had polished it, dusted it, but never dared to lift it, as though its weight might break her. Now, with Clara's scream in her ears and smoke seeping into the cabin, she shouldered it with a steadiness that startled even herself. She threw open the window and fired. The recoil jolted her back, but the shot rang true. One outlaw spun in the saddle, clutching his chest before tumbling lifeless into the snow. Her breath came sharp, but in her eyes there was no fear now, only resolve. For the first time since widowhood, she was not the victim left behind. She was the defender of her own home. The skirmish raged hot and brutal. Elias dropped another man with a shot to the gut, his teeth clenched against the sting in his shoulder. Koa wrestled a bandit to the ground, knife flashing, snow-stained red beneath them. Anika fired again, the sound of her husband's rifle echoing like a ghost called back to stand with her. At last, the survivors broke. 2 men, panicked, scrambled onto their horses and fled across the white horizon, their curses swallowed by the wind. The rest lay still in the snow, dark stains spreading beneath them. Silence followed, broken only by the hiss of steam where hot blood met cold ground. Elias lowered his rifle, chest heaving. Koa staggered to his feet, wiping a smear of crimson from his cheek. Anika remained at the window, the rifle clutched tight, her hands steady now, her face set like iron. Clara peeked from behind the log pile, her small voice trembling. "Are they gone?" Elias glanced at her, then at the woman and the young man who had stood their ground with him. His voice was rough. "They're gone." Snow drifted soft again, as though nothing had happened. Yet everything had changed. The cabin, once suffocating with grief, now stood like a fortress that had endured fire and storm. Within its walls, 3 souls had fought not as strangers but as kin, widow, drifter, and wounded wanderer. Bound by necessity, tempered by blood, they had carved out a fragile belonging in the heart of a merciless land. Anika lowered the rifle, her gaze lingering on Elias. For the first time, she did not look at him with suspicion or guarded distance. And Elias, chest aching with more than the fight, understood what love truly meant. It was not possession, nor longing, but the will to protect, even at the cost of oneself. Koa, bruised but unbroken, placed a hand over his wound and nodded once, a gesture of honor. In his survival, in his defense of the child, he had proven something greater than words, that unity could exist, fragile but real, even in a land carved by scars and divisions. The fire within them had burned away fear, grief, and solitude. What remained was something new, fragile but fierce, like embers in snow, waiting to grow. Morning broke clean and pale, the snow glittering like a million shards of glass scattered across the land. The fight had ended the day before, but its echoes lingered in the silence. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin blue threads, steady and calm, no longer the desperate beacon of a house under siege. The bodies had been dragged out into the distance, buried beneath drifts where wolves and crows would find them, but the weight of what had happened clung to the cabin's timbers like soot. Elias stood outside with his rifle slung low, scanning the horizon. Habit, he told himself. Yet as the light grew, there was no danger in sight, only the wide white world, silent but no longer hostile. His scar itched in the cold, a reminder of how close he had come again to death. Inside, Clara stirred from her blanket nest, her eyes bright with the innocent resilience of children. She peeked through the door, catching sight of him. "You're still here," she whispered, as though afraid he'd vanish if she spoke too loud. He gave her a faint smile. "For now." But he had already decided he could not stay. This was not his home. It never had been. He had fought, bled, and killed here, but the fire that burned inside these walls belonged to them, Anika and her child, not to a scarred drifter with nothing to his name. Koa rose later, his wound bound tight, his body lean and restless. He stood at the threshold, breathing the cold air, looking eastward where the plain stretched toward the shadowed ridges. His people would be waiting. Before he left, he turned to Elias. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other, strangers once, adversaries by blood and history, and now something else entirely. Koa extended his hand. Elias took it. No words passed between them, but the grip said enough. Respect forged in fire, a bond neither would forget. Then Koa walked into the snow, his figure shrinking against the horizon until the white swallowed him whole. Clara burst into tears when she saw him go, but Elias gathered her gently into his arms. "He's not gone," he told her softly. "He's just gone home." That night, Elias packed his meager belongings, tying them to the saddle with practiced hands. His horse stamped and snorted, sensing the departure. Clara watched him with wide, frightened eyes. At last she ran forward, clutching his coat, her voice cracking. "Don't leave. Please, don't leave us too." Her words struck deeper than any bullet. He froze, staring down at the small hands gripping him as though he were the last steady thing in her world. Anika appeared in the doorway, her shawl drawn tight. She said nothing, but her eyes met his, steady and unflinching. There was no plea on her lips, no confession, but there was something in her gaze, raw and weary. She was tired. Tired of holding a rifle at every sound in the dark, tired of waking alone to the echo of memories. Tired of being strong only because no one else would stand beside her. Elias's throat worked, but no words came. He could not promise more than he was. Yet he found himself lowering the stool bag, untying the cinch. His horse tossed its head, confused, as if sensing the change. That evening, he mended a broken shutter, his hands steady with nails and hammer. Later, he brought in fresh wood for the fire, stacking it neatly by the hearth. When the wind rose, he sat at the window, rifle across his knees, not because he was passing through, but because he meant to keep watch. The days that followed were quiet, healing in their own way. Clara braided the maner of his horse again, humming to herself, as though weaving him into her world with every knot. Anika, alone in her room, folded away the wedding dress she had kept hidden for years. She did not bury it, nor burn it. She laid it gently in a chest, her hands lingering over the fabric, not to forget, but to make space, for tomorrow, for something fragile and new. Elias watched all of this in silence. He never asked for a place here, never claimed it as his right. Yet little by little, he found himself staying. Staying not because he was lost, but because for the first time in a long, long while, he had been found. And so the cabin, once a tomb of grief, became something else entirely, a place of survival, of quiet laughter, of second chances. Snow still fell, storms still gathered on the horizon, but within those rough-hewn walls, a widow, a child, and a scarred drifter had carved out something stronger than fear. A home.